According to contemporary accounts and later memoirs, barely 3 weeks after Allied troops stormed the beaches of Normandy, one of Adolf Hitler's most trusted commanders walked into a room where the dictator sat and delivered a stark, unsparing verdict. The fighting as it stood could doom Germany. Paraphrasing what he believed needed to be said and what the regime refused to hear, Erwin Rommel urged a retreat or accommodation to preserve what remained of Germany's military capacity. Historians frame that moment as one of the clearest instances where professional military judgment collided with ideological rigidity. The exact wording survives only in fragments and recollections. Where the record is thin, this script reconstructs the scene from reports and Rommel's own communications. Erwin Rommel rose to prominence the way professional soldiers do when they meet the demands of chaos, by being where the bullets fell and by turning dangerous improvisation into expedient tactics. A veteran of the First World War, he carried forward a willingness to take calculated personal risk and a capacity to read the battlefield that made him useful to the Wehrmacht. In the spring of 1940, commanding the 7th Panzer, he cut through the French front with a tempo of attack that unnerved opponents and impressed superiors. The interwar years, the rapid mechanization of armies, and the political tumult of a Germany desperate for victories provided the opening for talented officers to rise quickly. Rommel seized it. North Africa gave him a stage. As commander of the Africa Corps, he matched audacity to logistics, winning a string of engagements that, to German audiences hungry for heroic narratives, seemed like proof of brilliance. British journalists and German propaganda alike baptized him the Desert Fox, a moniker that captured both admiration for his battlefield craft and the myth-making that turned a soldier into an emblem. In the field, his approach was hands-on, scouting forward, adjusting dispositions on the move, expecting officers to lead from the front. That willingness to share danger earned him loyalty among troops and a reputation that made him a figure of trust in Berlin. Yet reputation is not innocence. Rommel's rise occurred under the shadow of a regime that committed systematic crimes. Serving as a field marshal in Hitler's army meant sharing in the practical success of a war whose political aims and moral foundation were criminal. Any analysis of his decisions must keep that fact central. Operational skill did not redeem the larger context in which it operated. Discussing Rommel's defensive proposals and battlefield judgments is not an answer to, nor a mitigation of, the atrocities undertaken by the regime he served. His credibility in 1944 was real. He had the ear of men in power precisely because he could point to results. That credibility shaped his later assessments.
When the Allies began talking openly about an invasion of Western Europe, Rommel's focus turned to concrete technical problems. He was sent to the French coast to inspect, to count, to measure what could be done with men, material, and time. What he saw convinced him that a landing could and likely would happen. What alarmed him more was how the German defensive plan, centralized, rigid, preoccupied with ideological certainties, left the front vulnerable to a seaborne assault. The Atlantic Wall was, in many ways, an exercise in compensating for weaknesses. It was a line of physical obstacles and fortifications that stretched along thousands of kilometers of coast, from Norway down to the Spanish border. Concrete bunkers, beach obstacles, minefields, and anti-tank barriers were welded together with local garrison troops and coastal artillery batteries. For Rommel, however, this wall could not be a mere collection of concrete and wire. He believed the key was to make the first 100 meters of beach as lethal and unnegotiable as possible, to stop the enemy at the waterline before it could bring its superiority in men and material ashore. His reasoning was blunt and shaped by the modern realities of war. The Allies dominated the skies and the sea. They could assemble enormous supplies and move them across channels with a logistical depth Germany could not match on the Western Front. Mobile armored counterattacks, the panzers Rommel had used with effect in the past, required operational freedom, open terrain, fuel, radioed coordination, and the chance to strike. In a contested coastal zone, subject to enemy air interdiction and Allied naval gunfire, the very mobility that made German armored formations potent on other fronts could be neutralized. Rommel's solution was to turn the enemy's approach into an attritional grind, a coastline transformed into an immediate gauntlet so fierce that it would blunt the initial blow. That doctrine had practical consequences. Rommel pressed for more obstacles, more minefields, and a proliferation of small, dispersed strongpoints. He wanted anti-tank ditches and wooden or iron hedgehogs planted at the water's edge. He ordered the enlargement of concrete positions for machine guns and meant to place mortar and anti-tank weapons in positions that could rake the landing zones. He advocated for local initiative, commanders who could react without waiting for centralized orders, and for shore defenses that forced the Allies to pay dearly for every yard of ground. But Rommel did not operate in a vacuum. The German command structure was fragmented by political interference. Hitler's insistence on centralized control, the competition between the Wehrmacht and the SS, and the flawed intelligence picture all constrained the options available. On a higher level, German strategy still expected that any invasion would be an attempt on Pas de Calais, the narrow stretch across which the shortest route to Britain runs.
That expectation would be exploited. Allied deception played a decisive, deliberate role in shaping German expectations. Operation Fortitude was the name given to the wide-ranging counterintelligence plan designed to convince German High Command that the main invasion would occur at Pas de Calais or that Scandinavia might be the target, depending on the variant. The Allies created an entire phantom army on paper and in the air: fake radio traffic, inflatable tanks, dummy landing craft and airfields, and the steady drip of controlled leaks and double agent reports. Its aim was to fix German attention away from Normandy, to keep the best mobile formations poised where they were least needed. The deception worked. German commanders, reinforced by the weight of their preconceptions, kept forces and reserves away from Normandy in the critical hours that decided the beachhead's fate. When the tide of history began to fold onto that coastline on June 6, 1944, the initial German response was hampered by mislocation and by a chain of command that moved cautiously, awaiting orders that did not come. On the morning of the invasion, Rommel was not in his headquarters in the French theater. Multiple accounts place him away from the immediate front, attending to matters in Germany and, according to his wife Lucy, who later recounted the episode, inspecting preparations at home. Lucy Rommel would recall the day as charged. She remembered hearing the news and seeing the reaction as he made for the nearest rail link and then the front. Her recollections, like many personal memories from that month, arrive filtered through grief and the distortion of time. They are valuable because they show how the man perceived his duty, not because they provide a complete operational log. He returned in haste. Eyewitness accounts from German staff officers describe a commander who arrived furious and dispirited. One subordinate later wrote that Rommel moved through the corridors with a determination that was equal parts calculation and dread. He understood that the Allies' lodgment on the coast might not be merely a localized failure. It could be the opening of a strategic collapse if it was allowed to expand. He wanted to see the situation with his own eyes, to measure coastal losses, to inspect the capacity for counterattack. The Normandy landings themselves were a study in Allied preparation meeting German confusion. Weather that had looked forbidding days earlier cleared just enough for Eisenhower and his planners to seize a narrow window. The scale of the operation, thousands of ships, thousands of aircraft, and dozens of divisions, imposed a logistical weight that would be felt for months.
The Allies' capacity for reinforcing the beachhead, for local air superiority, and for supplying men and material created a dilemma for the Germans: either halt the attack on the sands immediately or watch the invaders establish a secure lodgment that would over time make German positions irrelevant. Rommel's immediate impulse, born of both his frontline instincts and his command experience, was to argue that the crucial hour was the landing itself. If the Allies could be stopped at the water, mobile counterattacks would not be decisive. The whole enemy enterprise might be aborted. But if the enemy established a beachhead, the logistical depth would favor the invaders. As the days of June unfolded, the grim arithmetic of reinforcement and attrition became evident. Ships continued to cross the Channel. Air cover, though contested, tilted in favor of the Allies. The beachhead, meant to be a fragile foothold, grew stubborn with every landing. It was in that atmosphere of mounting pressure and dawning strategic reality that Rommel's voice moved from local tactical adjustments to broader strategic counsel. He had, in earlier months, written to people in Berlin and in the field expressing his concerns. He sent reports and recommended measures that might raise the cost of an invasion. But the reality confronting him by mid to late June was less technical than political. The question became not only how to fight, but whether continued resistance on Hitler's terms still served Germany's long-term survival. The record of what transpired next is partial. Multiple staff memoranda, fragments of intercepted communications, and recollections by participants suggest that in the weeks following the landings, Rommel issued an uncompromising assessment. The Wehrmacht could not expect to prevail in the West if the Allies consolidated. According to those accounts, he made a direct appeal to Hitler, urging a strategic withdrawal to shorten lines, to conserve forces, and, at the extreme, consider negotiations that would spare Germany total ruin. The title line that circulates in popular memory, "Retreat now or lose everything," captures the bluntness attributed to him. It is a paraphrase of a professional judgment. It is not a verbatim transcript. Where material is missing, this narrative reconstructs conversations in the manner historians often must, by knitting together letters, diary mentions, and later testimony. Reconstruction note. The scene described next synthesizes available reports, cables, and memoirs. Exact words cannot be certified. The spirit of the exchange is what contemporary sources converge upon. In a room dominated by maps and the portrait of a leader convinced of his destiny, Rommel faced the central decision-maker. He presented the evidence plainly.
The air and naval dominance of the Allies, the steady funneling of men and supplies across the Channel, the deception that had misallocated German reserves, and the inability to move armored formations where they were needed, all of it meant that continuing to hold exposed coastal positions without the possibility of strategic maneuver was, in his view, tantamount to courting annihilation. He argued that a controlled withdrawal, or at the very least a modification of orders that allowed for local initiative, could conserve forces, deny the enemy an immediate occupation of the industrial heartlands, and leave Germany with bargaining power. He framed this not as surrender, but as damage control, a way to prevent collapse by making choices now when there was still some leverage. Hitler's response, as reported by staff officers and later recounted by participants, mixed outrage with doctrinal certainty. To suggest retreat, in Hitler's framing, was to weaken national will. It pitted operational necessity against ideological absolutes. Hitler's politics insisted on holding ground as a symbol of resolve. He believed defeatist talk would sap morale and expose the regime to collapse from within. To Hitler, the idea of negotiating from a position of weakness was not merely impolitic, it was treasonous. He doubled down on orders for stiff resistance and for the commitment of reserves he had been reluctant to release. The clash was not only strategic, it was moral and existential. Rommel, who had spent his career shaping and leading men under the assumption that careful planning and swift action could save lives and win battles, now found himself the messenger of a verdict that ran against the political grain. He was not asking for capitulation, he was demanding change in how Germany would use what remained of its capabilities. The stakes were cruelty and loss, more endless battles, more towns flattened, more lives spent in a war that might have already become unwinnable. Eyewitness testimony that survived the immediate aftermath recalls the frustration in Rommel's voice. An aide wrote later that Rommel's face was sober to the point of being already aged. His son, Manfred, who would later become a mayor and public figure in his own right, remembered in interviews a father acutely aware of military realities and yet trapped by the politics above him. Manfred's recollection is less about the substance of high strategy and more about the man's sense of moral urgency, that his father believed he was warning against a preventable catastrophe. Even as this drama played out at the top, the ground war in Normandy created its own microcosms of decision and loss. German commanders at lower levels fretted about local supply, about fuel shortages that immobilized tanks at the least convenient moments, about the attrition of trained men replaced by hastily assembled conscripts.
The German military system, designed initially for rapid campaigns and decisive maneuvers, had become mired in static, grinding warfare for which it was poorly prepared. The Allies, meanwhile, mined and ferried reinforcements across the Channel with an efficiency that would eventually overwhelm any piecemeal German response. Rommel's position, precisely because it was professional and not primarily political, became dangerous. Military advice that implied a change in political direction risked being labeled defeatist or disloyal. The same competence that had won him accolades could be turned into a political liability when it contradicted the Führer's vision. Hitler increasingly saw his generals as either instruments of will or obstacles to be removed. In these weeks, the broader moral context hardened. Reports from the Eastern Front and dismantled territories continued to filter in, evidence of mass killings and brutal occupation policies that were part of the regime's criminal enterprise. For some officers, including Rommel, the accumulation of those reports shifted personal assessments of what serving the regime meant. It would be incorrect to suggest that this shift absolved them of responsibility. Officers were complicit by continuing to function within the system. But it does explain the growing dissonance between professional military calculation and political loyalty. By the third week of June, Rommel's calculations had hardened into an urgent counsel. Something had to give. The precise content and timing of the conversation with Hitler should be read with caution. Contemporaneous notes are fragmentary, and later memoirs reflect memory's distortion. Yet multiple sources converge on the fact that Rommel sought to persuade the political leadership to choose preservation rather than annihilation. To his mind, a degree of accommodation, or at least the freedom to conduct strategic withdrawals, offered the only chance of preventing Germany's total exhaustion. There is an image that encapsulates the problem, a fortress that exists more in a leader's dream than in reality. Concrete bunkers can be built, barbed wire can be strung, and propaganda can declare defiance. But when logistical channels are severed, when air and sea control belong to the enemy, and when morale withers under grinding losses, the fortress becomes a mausoleum rather than a bastion. Rommel tried to communicate that image with the bluntness of someone who had spent decades watching battlefields turn on the small advantages of supply and movement. What followed in the immediate days after the reported council was not the concession Rommel hoped for. The political center intensified orders to hold ground. Hitler's belief in a decisive reversal, a political miracle, or a strategic turn remained unshaken. The high command fractured between those who saw the necessity of pragmatic concessions and those who regarded any talk of compromise as betrayal.
Rommel's reputation made his warnings more visible, but it also made him a threat to a regime intolerant of dissent. The stage was now set for consequences that would soon be personal. The chain of events that would remove Rommel from active command and embroil him, indirectly, in the violent political purges of summer 1944 had already begun to form. But that story moves from the world of strategy to the more intimate realm of injury, suspicion, and coercion, a progression that turns public decisions into private tragedies. For now, the viewer should absorb the core reality. A seasoned commander, returned to the front with data in hand, told his political leadership that the path they chose risked everything. His counsel was professional and stern. History would record that the choice was not heated. The tension between military feasibility and ideological intransigence now hung over Germany's western front like a dark cloud, and the country's fate tilted on the axis of whether political power could admit error when lives and cities were at stake. If this exploration of Rommel's strategic reasoning and the Normandy crisis interests you, and you want more deep dives into pivotal moments of World War II, subscribe for more analyses that connect military decisions to their human consequences. The decisions made in the weeks after D-Day were not merely technical, they were moral choices with material effects. The failure to negotiate or to withdraw was in part a political decision grounded in ideological certainty and the cult of obedience. That decision would not only shape the battlefield, it would determine which cities burned, which civilians died, and which soldiers were thrown into futile defenses. Rommel's warning, whether uttered as a phrase later paraphrased by historians or expressed over a series of desperate meetings, had an urgency that extended far beyond battlefield diagrams. It was about the preservation of human life against the logic of total war. As June unfolded into July, the theater of operations around Normandy hardened into attrition. German attempts at counterattack were frustrated by lack of fuel and by Allied air supremacy that made concentration of forces dangerous. The Allies, consolidating their lodgment and extending supply piers across the Channel, turned what might have been a temporary foothold into a permanent advantage. Rommel watched as his worst fears gradually became visible in the map lines and casualty lists. At the same time, fissures within the German officer corps widened. Frustrations that had been marginal whispers in staff rooms crystallized into bold talk in certain circles. If the political center refused to act to preserve the nation, then those who could bear the consequences considered more extreme measures. For Rommel, the moral calculus remained fraught. He did not become an opponent of the regime in the straightforward way later narratives sometimes suggest.
He was a professional soldier whose first loyalty in his mind was to Germany and its people, even as serving the state meant participating in, or at least supporting with silence, policies that were reprehensible. But this rising tension carried personal consequences. In a country where dissent was deadly and dissenters were silenced with ruthless efficacy, a general who argued for retreat risked being labeled defeatist or worse. The same institutions that had lionized Rommel in victory could, under pressure, turn on him in humiliation. The months after D-Day would reveal how precarious a position that was. A man revered for competence, now at risk because the competence contradicted the ideology of those in power. What followed, Rommel's injury, his removal from command, the failed assassination attempts against Hitler, and the brutal purges that followed, would turn political calculations into personal tragedies. But those are chapters that require their own pacing. For the moment, the story waits on the threshold of escalation. A command crisis in Berlin, a beachhead that refuses to break, and a commander whose warning went unaccepted. The human cost of that refusal would soon become impossible to ignore. The days after D-Day hardened into a lesson in attrition and blunt arithmetic. The lodgment that the Allies had fought to make seemed at once precarious and inexorable, fragile on any single morning, cumulative in its momentum. Ships kept coming, and with every convoy the gap in resources between the two sides widened. Rommel watched this unfold on maps and casualty lists. He watched it in faces, the creased, exhausted countenances of commanders who could not get the fuel their tanks needed or the radios their panzer grenadiers required. Each delay, each misallocated reserve, each failed counterattack confirmed the assessment he had made in conversations at the top, that the West had become a theater whose material laws increasingly favored the invader. Those realities do not by themselves explain the turn of events that followed. War is always partly a matter of chance, of weather, of a single road suddenly clogged by a wrecked truck. But in Germany in the summer of 1944, chance collided with politics in ways that made fortune cruel and swift. By mid-July, the threads that would entangle Rommel had already drawn taut. His professional credibility marked him as someone whose objections were inconvenient to the ideological narrative, and the growing whisper network among military men had begun to attract the attention of a regime that brooked no dissent. On July 17, 1944, that collision became physical. The event is one of the pivotal, documented moments of Rommel's biography, a near-failed car crash that would take him out of the field at a moment when his counsel was most needed. The circumstances of the accident are relatively clear in their broad outline, even if some details remain contested.
Rommel was traveling in his staff car in the vicinity of St. Foy-de-Mauves when Allied aircraft, operating in a theater where air superiority was increasingly contested, engaged ground targets. Accounts vary on whether the car was deliberately targeted or caught in the sweep of an interdiction sortie. The result was devastating. His vehicle left the road and struck a tree. Rommel suffered severe head injuries, including a fractured skull, and multiple other traumas. He was rushed to a hospital in western France and then evacuated to Germany for surgery and prolonged convalescence. Lucy Rommel later described the scene of those days in the private language of a wife whose husband had been violently injured. He lay pale, she recalled in later testimony, and he had to learn again how to do small things. Manfred Rommel, his son, remembered the shock and helplessness of that summer. For a period, the man who had been an authoritarian presence at home became a fragile patient. These recollections are not operational logs. They are human fragments that explain what the paperwork cannot, the bodily vulnerability of a commander who had always preferred to lead from the front. The timing of the crash mattered more than the mechanics. Rommel's incapacitation removed a public face of prudence and practical realism from the theater at precisely the moment when internal German debates were intensifying. His wound meant he would be largely absent during the critical days that followed, days that included the most audacious attempt to end Hitler's rule from within the officer corps. On July 20, 1944, a small group of German officers executed a plot to assassinate Adolf Hitler at his East Prussian headquarters. The attempt failed. The bomb planted by Colonel Klaus von Stauffenberg exploded, but Hitler survived with relatively minor injuries. The plot's failure unleashed a savage, methodical purge. The Gestapo and the People's Court moved quickly to identify, arrest, and execute conspirators and their associates. Hundreds were killed or sent to concentration camps. The reaction was not simply retribution. It was a demonstration designed to extinguish the possibility of similar initiatives and to signal that even high-ranking officers were not beyond the reach of the state's vengeance. Rommel's relationship to the plot was ambiguous and protean. Modern histories and wartime interrogations offer a complicated picture that resists simple categorization. He had been in communication with elements of the resistance. He had, according to multiple accounts, discussed the desirability of removing Hitler from power, but not as an endorsement of assassination. Rommel's preference, as he repeatedly stated in private, leaned toward legalistic or political removal, arrests, a forced deposition, the installation of a government that would negotiate.
He believed that the legitimacy of a post-Hitler regime would be crucial to preserving order and to striking a better end for Germany. To commit a direct act of regicide, in his view, would be unlawful and would threaten the nation with further chaos. This distinction mattered for the regime that watched conspiratorial talk like a contagion. In the climate of the summer of 1944, nuance was a dangerous currency. For men like Wilhelm Keitel, Heinrich Himmler, and the officers tasked with hunting down traitors, any conversation that hinted at removing Hitler could be construed as complicity. The instruments of the state treated Rommel's communications and contacts as prima facie evidence to be exploited for a public demonstration of deterrence. Rommel was further compromised by the fact that he had been widely admired and recognized. That fame, which had earlier provided him a measure of protection, a public figure the regime could use for propaganda, now became a liability. If Rommel could be implicated, then the message to the officer corps would be clear. No rank, no reputation would make one immune. After the July 20 attempt, the Gestapo opened files. Investigators interviewed a range of officers, interrogated staff, and began to assemble a mosaic of associations. There is a record of Rommel's conversations with certain conspirators in the weeks leading up to the attempt. He had been approached, he had not been an active participant, and he had repeatedly balked at plans for bloodshed. These are the contours of a political life being read against the ledger of crime and survival. Rommel's injury complicated matters administratively and morally. Confined to hospitals and convalescent facilities, he was less able to respond to summonses and less able to marshal friends in his defense. Yet he remained a target. The regime preferred not to make martyrs of popular figures, but neither would it tolerate ambiguity. The result was an ultimatum offered in October, a grimly bureaucratic choice between death with honor and public ruin. On October 14, 1944, Rommel was summoned to a meeting with senior officers acting on Hitler's authority. The precise chronology of the meeting and the identities of every interlocutor have been reconstructed from the testimony of survivors and post-war interrogations. What is not disputed is the content of the offer. Rommel could commit suicide and receive a state funeral, a public narrative that would frame his death as resulting from war wounds, and his family would be spared the persecution that often followed accusations of treason. If he refused, he would be arrested, publicly disgraced in a people's court, and his family would face reprisals. The choice was presented as if it were a legal option, but it was coercive to its core. The state offered dignity on condition of silence and obedience.
This moment must be described plainly. A man forced to choose between preserving the lives and futures of those he loved and preserving his freedom to defend himself in public. It is the intersection of political terror and personal calculation. For Rommel, whose sense of duty included a fierce protection of his household, the offer was brutally enticing. Manfred Rommel later recalled his father's tornness. He was a soldier who could not countenance the spectacle of his family destroyed for his mistakes. Modern historians interpret Rommel's decision through many lenses, as pragmatism, as cowardice, as sacrifice. None of these single words captures the moral texture of the act. Rommel accepted the offer. He took his own life on October 14, 1944. The official announcement to the public couched the death as the result of his earlier injuries and praised him with the language of state imprimatur, a field marshal who had fallen as the result of war wounds. The regime staged a state funeral meant to maintain morale and to use Rommel's celebrity to bolster a narrative of wounded patriotism rather than internal collapse. These gestures were, in their way, cynical. They offered a final honor to a man who had been denied the right to a public defense and whose last decision was coerced by the threat of violence against those he loved. Even as the state attempted to sterilize the moment for propaganda, the undercurrents of truth were not so easily extinguished. Rumors circulated among the troops and in civilian populations. In quiet rooms, men whispered that the Desert Fox had been forced to drink poison. For some officers who survived the war, and for historians who later sifted through the documents, Rommel's end became emblematic of something larger: the fate of professional soldiers who find themselves trapped within authoritarian structures that will not permit the correction of error. It is crucial to hold two truths together when evaluating these events. First, Rommel's professional judgments in the summer of 1944, his insistence that the Western Front required either accommodation or a strategic withdrawal to avoid blind annihilation, were strategically sound in their assessment of material realities. The invasion's logistical advantages, the Allies' industrial depth, and the deception that had fixed German reserves away from Normandy meant that Germany's prospects in the West were dim unless fundamental strategic choices were made. Second, such judgments do not erase or excuse moral complicity. Rommel served a criminal regime. His skill did not cancel the crimes that regime perpetrated. His insistence on preserving German lives must be understood alongside a broader responsibility that he, like other officers of his rank, bore by participating in and supporting a regime that committed mass murder. The years that followed Rommel's death would vindicate elements of his counsel in the bluntest terms.
The Normandy beachhead expanded. The breakout in late July and August pushed German formations into an inexorable retreat, and the liberation of Paris in August 1944 was a symbolic and strategic collapse of German control in Western Europe. From the perspective of late 1944 into 1945, what Rommel had warned about, the steady erosion of German capability and the cost of stubbornly defending untenable positions, was visible to all. Cities burned, soldiers were lost in futile holding actions, and civilian populations paid the price as German commanders attempted to hold lines that were no longer defensible. Yet it would be an error to present Rommel as the single seer whose counsel could have altered the course of history. The failure to retreat in time was not solely a product of Hitler's pride. It was the culmination of political choices, military constraints, and social dynamics that stretched back years. The Wehrmacht had been enmeshed with a political project that made independent military judgment difficult and dangerous. Logistics, industrial mobilization, the Eastern Front's demands, and the human will of populations resisting occupation, all of these factors constrained any single actor's scope for decisive change. Rommel's advice, while cogent, was one voice among many, and arrived at a moment when the apparatus of the state had become deeply resistant to correction. The question that persists, and that this story forces upon us, is not whether Rommel was right about tactics. He was. The question is moral and institutional. Why did a system that could so plainly be steered by reason and prudence instead chose the path of maximal destruction? The answer lies partially in Hitler's ideological rigidity and the mechanisms of terror that enforced his will. It lies partially in the culture of obedience that the regime cultivated among its officers and civilians. It lies, too, in the human tendency to mistake symbolism for strategy, holding ground as a proof of resolve rather than as a calculated use of force. Rommel's life and death illuminate the cost of that mixture. A talented commander, celebrated in victory and corrupted by association in crime, became a messenger whose voice the regime refused to hear. The tragedies that followed, the lives lost in the battles of 1944 and 1945, the cities razed in the name of stubborn defense, the moral compromise of those who served under orders, are not reducible to a single man or a single decision. But Rommel's warning, paraphrased in the bluntness of popular memory as retreat now or lose everything, remains significant because it crystallized a professional judgment that was more humane than the fanaticism that rejected it. There is a further layer of consequence. The regime's treatment of Rommel after the July 20 attempt, the coercion, the manufactured public narrative, the appropriation of a funeral for propaganda, tells us about the nature of power in late Nazi Germany.
The state could validate or destroy reputations at will. It could, for a moment, pretend to honor a man while having already determined his fate. The performance of honor became a means of controlling memory, even as it erased contingency. For later generations, untangling these performances from the truth of events required painstaking archival work, testimony, and a willingness to hold uncomfortable contradictions, admiration for tactical skill alongside condemnation of political complicity. When historians sift the documents, certain modest but important judgments emerge. Rommel's tactical prescriptions for coastal defense were risk-averse and born of real concern. His strategic counsel to preserve forces for possible negotiation or to withdraw to positions that could be sustained was a rational appraisal of material disadvantage. His opposition to assassination, his preference for legalistic removal of Hitler, and his wavering engagement with conspirators reveal a man trying to reconcile a soldier's ethic with the political reality of tyranny. His eventual decision to accept suicide rather than public trial was a final act in which the private concern for family and a soldier's resignation to duty combined tragically. The moral balance sheet is therefore unsettled. Rommel was neither a hero freed from association with a criminal regime, nor simply a cog in a machine. He was both a participant and a critic in the margins, a respected commander whose choices were bounded by the politics of the day. To treat his life as an uncomplicated parable of redemption would be to misunderstand the era's complexity. To reduce him purely to complicity would be to miss the particular human tragedy of a man who recognized consequence and attempted, in his way, to diminish it. In closing, the story of Rommel's warning and its aftermath is a caution about the cost of ignored counsel when political authority is divorced from reality.
there is a practical lesson in strategy. When logistical and operational realities are clear, obstinacy can accelerate ruin. There is a moral lesson as well. Complicity is often a matter of degrees, and judgment must be exact about where tactical competence intersects with moral responsibility. The title that frames this narrative, the reported paraphrase that Rommel urged Hitler to retreat now or lose everything just weeks after D-Day, captures both the spirit of his counsel and the tragic futility of a regime that could not accept it. Where the documentary record is thin, the reconstruction offered here draws on contemporaneous letters, staff reports, and later testimony to capture the exchange's essential character. The exact wording cannot be certified in every instance, and where phrasing is uncertain, it must be read as paraphrase rather than verbatim quotation. If the arc of this episode leaves the viewer with a sense of melancholy, it is appropriate.
The human cost of stubborn political choices, measured in ruined cities, in dead soldiers on both sides, in the silenced voices of those who tried to intervene, is the grim arithmetic of the summer and autumn of 1944. Rommel's life ended under compulsion. His warning was not heeded. History rolled on. For those who want to explore these events further, the sources listed in the description include primary documents and respected secondary studies that document the Normandy campaign, Operation Fortitude, the July 20 plot, and Rommel's final months. A careful reading of those sources is the best way to evaluate the nuances left out of any single narrative. If you found this deep dive helpful, watch our companion video that reconstructs the operational timeline of Normandy week by week, and check the description for a curated list of books and archival materials.